Hello, my name is John Bullion. Since the early 1970s, the United States has been involved in what is called a war on drugs. While this is called a war on drugs, in reality, the real war has not been waged against inanimate objects, but people who use them. Many of the enemies are our own citizens for making a personal decision to use drugs recreationally or even with doctor's orders for medicinal purposes. Marijuana, for example, is considered a Schedule I narcotic, just like heroin. The real counter to the current prohibition policy is drug use is a social issue, and it's not a criminal issue. And that is the fundamental change that needs to be addressed to show the war on drugs is a failure. It has failed in its primary function to reduce drugs in the United States. It has increased violence in the U.S. as well as in other countries, and it has wasted taxpayer money. It is estimated currently since 1971 that the war on drugs has consumed $1 trillion in U.S. currency. It's caused pain and suffering to American citizens from its very inception by placing non-violent offenders in prison. And these draconian laws that non-violent people are subjected to are neither fair nor reasonable. The result of taking an otherwise normal law-abiding citizen and putting them in prison with violent offenders for years for making a personal decision is immoral. In many cases, drug use has a minimum mandatory sentence that lasts longer than some have served for property damage, rape, even murder. Minimum mandatory sentencing means that the judges are not allowed to use their discretion when sentencing, and the result is sending people to prison where they are left with few options, which over time turns them into animals or victims. Upon release, the conviction of the felony will follow that person the rest of their lives and significantly decrease their chance to gain any meaningful employment. These hardships don't stop with the individual. It also has a negative impact on their family, who must deal with the loss of their parent, their spouse, or their loved one. The taxpayer is also burdened, as they must support the prisons that provide assistance to family members who depend on the individual who was convicted to support them and their children, who could possibly be displaced, end up homeless, or need some other form of social care. The number of people being placed in prison in itself is a problem, as no other country incarcerates more of its population than the United States. This is alarming considering the fact that for the last 3 years there's been a steady decline in this, yet we are still number one. Lastly, this does nothing to address the issue of drug use for those who have an addiction, as treatment and rehabilitation are far superior in a positive environment than placing someone in prison for years with violent offenders. When we move away from the individual and focus on the policy itself, there's no improvement. The intended results have failed in themselves. We have more drugs in the country than when this notion was brought to the forefront of our judicial system in the 70s. The drugs are purer, they cost less, and they're easily available. The level of violence is maintained, and in fact, from an economic point of view, we actually support drug cartels and continue their existence because of the drug war laws. This was pointed out by Nobel Prize-winning economist Professor Milton Friedman, who stated, "If you look at the drug war from a purely economic point of view, the role of the government is to protect the drug cartel. That is literally true." End quote. The purpose of law enforcement is better served catching violent criminals than ruining the lives of individuals because they made a choice to use a drug. Some may point out that with freedom comes an expected acceptance of responsibility, and this is true. The point made that drugs are generally harmful to your health, reduces your ambition, or kills your brain cells is not in dispute. This is also the case with cigarettes and alcohol, which are responsible for property damage, higher taxes, millions of deaths. They're still legal, and the choice to use them is still left to the individual with an expectation of responsibility and knowledge of consequence if used inappropriately. They're also cheaper because they're legal and thus available for people to purchase without turning to violence and crime. In 1925, the famous journalist H.L. Mencken wrote an impassioned plea about prohibition. He stated, "Prohibition has not only failed in its promises, but actually created additional serious and disturbing social problems throughout society. There's not less drunkenness in the Republic, but more. There is not less crime, but more. The cost of government is not smaller, but vastly greater. Respect for law has not increased, it is diminished." End quote. The current drug law in the United States is based on the idea of prohibition, and this is failed concept. It did not work with abortion, it did not work with alcohol, and it's not working with the drug war. Do you notice a trend? Those that insist we continue on with the failed policy that cost millions of dollars and destroyed countless lives is immoral and wrong. Thank you for your time.